Some roads take you somewhere. Others stay with you forever. Route 66 was never just a stretch of pavement. It was a living story, etched across the heart of America. A road built on dust, dreams, and the quiet hum of wanderlust. From the rusted signs to the faded motels, its spirit lingers like a whisper beneath the wind, calling us back. Maybe you've never driven it. Maybe you've only heard the name in an old song or seen it stenciled on a vintage postcard. But somewhere inside, you know this road. You've felt its weight in a photograph. You've heard its rhythm in the rumble of an old truck on a lonely night highway. You've tasted it in a roadside milkshake that somehow felt like home. Tonight on Sleepytown Radio, we invite you to close your eyes and take a slow ride down the Mother Road, not to get somewhere, but to remember what it meant to travel, to drift, to dream. Because Route 66 wasn't just the path between Chicago and Los Angeles. It was the ribbon that tied together small towns and big hopes, the road that carried workers and wanderers, soldiers and singers, families chasing promise, and souls chasing peace. It bore witness to some of the hardest chapters in American history: dust storms, lost farms, empty pockets, and yet it also held space for neon signs, laughter at the counter, and the thrill of headlights sweeping through the dark. It was refuge, escape, adventure, and always a return. This journey we're about to take isn't just through time, it's through memory. Quiet, steady, and tender. The kind of memory you don't rush. The kind that settles in your chest like the warmth of a worn-out diner booth at dusk. So if the world has been moving too fast lately, if your thoughts are restless and your heart needs a slower rhythm, this road is for you. There's no destination, only the gentle curve ahead. Welcome back to Sleepytown Radio, where the stories are slow, the past feels close, and the nights never rush you. Let's begin with where it all started, not with highways or headlights, but with the spirit of movement itself. In a time before the road even had a name. Long before Route 66 was even imagined, before asphalt was poured and signs were hammered into the ground, America had already begun its restless journey west. There were no road maps then, only the sun by day, stars by night, and the steady determination of those who believed there was something better just beyond the horizon. They were settlers, homesteaders, dreamers, men and women who left what little they had behind in search of fertile land, new beginnings, and a place to plant their futures. They crossed the vast, untamed interior of the country in covered wagons, their wheels creaking against rock and mud, cutting lines into the earth that would one day become highways. These early trails were not routes of comfort. They were carved in hardship. There were no motels at dusk or diners with warm coffee. There was only the wind, the wild, and the hope that the next day would bring safety, or at least progress. Families traveled slowly, 10, maybe 15 miles a day. Children sat shoulder to shoulder in wooden carts, clutching worn-out dolls or chipped tin cups. Mothers boiled coffee over open fires. Fathers walked beside oxen with cracked leather reins and dust up to their knees. There were no mile markers, no signs to say, "You're almost there." Only instinct, prayer, and sheer grit. Through wide plains, snow-covered hills, desert heat, and river crossings, these early Americans kept going. They built makeshift roads with their own hands, sometimes cutting paths through forests or leveling ground with pickaxes and shovels. Every footprint and wagon wheel track became part of an invisible map, one passed along from traveler to traveler, whispered across campfires and scribbled into hand-drawn journals. By the mid-1800s, these dirt trails began to take shape. Some became stagecoach lines. Others served as the routes for the Pony Express. And when the iron horse came thundering in, the railroad, it seemed for a time that the age of the wagon had passed. The railroads changed everything. Trains could move people and freight farther, faster. Steam locomotives roared through valleys and over bridges, carrying not just goods, but ideas, cultures, letters, and dreams. Steel tracks stitched the country together. And yet, for all their might, the trains followed fixed paths. They connected cities, yes, but bypassed the quiet in-betweens, the little towns, the crossroads, the family farms and roadside fruit stands. Even in the golden age of rail, something was missing. Freedom. Freedom to stop, to choose your own pace, to pull over and rest under a cottonwood tree, to take a detour just because a sign caught your eye, or a field looked like the one from your grandfather's stories. And so, America waited for something more, a new kind of road, one that didn't belong to the rail companies, and didn't require a conductor's whistle to carry you forward. A road that any family with 4 wheels and a tank of gas could follow, not just to get somewhere, but to find themselves along the way. That longing, that wanderer's spirit, had already been burning in the American soul for generations. It was passed down through the wagon trails of the pioneers, carried in the black smoke of locomotives, and whispered across the plains like a promise that one day we'd have a road of our own, a road that wasn't just built by engineers, but by the dreams of a moving people. And when that road finally came, when Route 66 stretched across the country from Chicago to the Pacific, it didn't come from nowhere. It followed the footsteps of those who walked before. The wagons, the riders, the seekers. It took their dust, their stories, their persistence, and paved over them with purpose. So as we begin our slow journey down Route 66 tonight, remember this. The highway wasn't born from nowhere. It rose from the ground beneath tired boots and wagon wheels. It inherited the legacy of movement, the courage of those who believed that the road ahead, no matter how long or uncertain, was always worth traveling. And in that spirit we move forward, toward a moment in time when the car would become king, and the American road trip would take its first real breath. The railroad had carried America far. It had stitched coast to coast in steel and smoke, in whistles and timetables. But by the early 1900s, something else had begun to hum beneath the nation's heartbeat. It didn't run on tracks. It ran on rubber. The automobile wasn't just a new invention. It was a revolution, quietly waiting to erupt, restless in the hands of everyday people. In 1910, only about 180,000 cars rattled across American roads. But within just a decade, that number soared into the millions. Suddenly, the road belonged not to trains or trolleys, but to anyone who could turn a key. And that changed everything. The car didn't just offer transportation, it offered choice. It meant you could leave when you wanted, go where you pleased, and stop wherever your heart or a dusty roadside pie sign called you. It gave a kind of freedom the railroads never could. You didn't need a ticket or a timetable. You needed gas, a sturdy engine, and maybe a little faith. But there was one big problem. The cars had arrived, but the roads had not. Most of America's rural byways were little more than horse trails or washed-out dirt paths, full of ruts, rocks, and mud that turned to soup with the first rain. Tires spun, axles cracked, windshields clogged with dust and flying gravel. Driving wasn't a pastime. It was an ordeal. In cities, pavement existed in patches, here and there, but they didn't connect. One town might have a main street made of bricks, while the next was just gravel and guesswork. If you tried to drive across the country, you'd find yourself zigzagging through a chaotic patchwork of surfaces, dead ends, and unmarked crossroads. Americans were ready to drive, but the land itself wasn't ready to be driven. That's when a new kind of dream began to form. Not just of cars, but of where cars could go. The open road had long been a metaphor in songs and stories, but now it became something tangible, a necessity, a national goal, a hope. People began to imagine a different kind of America, one connected by real roads, smooth, continuous, roads that didn't just end in the next town, but flowed from city to countryside, from coast to coast. Roads that made travel not just possible, but inviting. By the 1920s, this idea was no longer just an engineer's sketch. It was a cultural cry. The freedom of the automobile needed structure, and that structure had to be built, mile by mile, through farmlands, hills, and main streets. A car without roads is like a boat without water, and Americans, newly mobile, newly dreaming, were ready to ride. That's when the first calls for a national highway system took root. Visionaries, mayors, business owners, they all saw it. If the country could be connected, then commerce would follow. So would tourism. So would prosperity. And so would joy, because this wasn't just about trucks hauling grain. This was about families packing into Model Ts for summer adventures, about postcards sent from places with funny names, about honeymooners pulling off the road to watch the sunset from a windshield smeared with bugs and wonder. It was about motion as a way of life. The coming of the automobile didn't erase America's pioneer past. It extended it. The wagons became engines. The slow, creaking trails became faster and louder. But the spirit remained the same. A people always looking ahead. Soon, from the middle of the country, a bold idea would rise. A road that connected the great Midwest to the shining West Coast. Not in a straight line, but in a path that wove through the lives of real people, real towns, and real dreams. That road was Route 66. But before it could exist, before a single signpost could go up, it began as a whisper carried on tires, a hope sparked by engines, and a country finally ready to move. As cars began to claim the land once ruled by horses and trains, America stood at a crossroads, quite literally. The future was no longer about if people would drive. It was about where they could go, and amid all the dust and dreaming, there was one man who saw it clearer than most. His name was Cyrus Avery, a businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma. To most, he looked like a man of numbers and maps. But deep down, Avery was a man of vision. Not the loud, ambitious kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sees not just what is, but what could be. In the 1920s, while the country was still adjusting to the automobile boom, Avery was already thinking years ahead. He looked out across the vast middle of the nation, at the small towns, the farms, the dusty crossroads, and he asked a simple but powerful question. Why should all the roads run along the coasts? Why not through the heart? At the time, the idea of a major cross-country road was still in its infancy. Most routes were regional, fragmented. But Avery saw an opportunity, not just for Oklahoma, but for every forgotten community between Chicago and Los Angeles. A road that didn't just connect, but uplift. A road that didn't bypass small towns, but brought life into them. He envisioned a highway that would cut across the country diagonally, linking the industrial power of Chicago with the Pacific shimmer of Los Angeles, passing straight through Tulsa and dozens of overlooked places in between. It wasn't just a practical idea. It was a statement that the middle of America mattered, that progress didn't have to mean skipping over those who lived away from the coasts. Avery believed that the road could bring jobs, growth, and tourism, that it could help farmers get their goods to market faster, that it could put diners, motels, and service stations right where they were needed most. It was, in every way, the infrastructure of hope. Originally, Avery wanted the new road to be named U.S. Route 60. It sounded clean, modern, balanced. But that number had already been claimed by another route, sparking a bureaucratic back and forth. Eventually, they settled on Route 66. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but somehow it felt just right. Short, catchy, musical, easy to remember, easy to paint on signs. And soon, it would become more than a number. It would become a symbol. But Avery's efforts didn't stop with naming the road. He founded the U.S. 66 Highway Association, a group devoted not just to promoting the route, but to shaping its identity. He coined the phrase that would echo for generations: the Main Street of America. And it wasn't just clever branding. It was the truth, because Route 66 wouldn't be built like a modern freeway, isolated from the people it passed. It would wind through places, past mom and pop shops, gas pumps with bells, front porches with rocking chairs, and sidewalks where kids still played stickball. It would belong to the people. It wasn't just a highway. It was a handshake between towns, a bridge between where you were and where you hoped to be. Under Avery's leadership and tireless advocacy, the road began to take shape, not just in concrete and gravel, but in the hearts of Americans who saw it as their path forward. And when the day finally came to mark it official on November 11th, 1926, Route 66 was born. It would take years before it was fully paved, but even in its rougher early days, the road drew travelers like a magnet. It whispered promise. It sang of distance and discovery, and in every way, it carried the fingerprints of a man from Tulsa who believed in possibility, not just for cars or commerce, but for connection. The dream had begun. The mother road had taken her first breath. Now, it was time to roll. On a quiet Thursday in November 11th, 1926, a number was officially assigned to a new stretch of highway. Just a number on paper, Route 66, but in time, that number would come to mean more than anyone could have imagined. For years, Cyrus Avery and others had lobbied, mapped, and dreamed. Their vision of a road stretching from Chicago to Los Angeles, across 8 states and nearly 2,500 miles, was no longer just a concept. It was now a recognized part of America's growing network of highways. It wasn't built overnight. Much of it was still gravel, dirt, and rough-edged turns. There were long stretches through farmland where the road narrowed to a single lane and veered sharply past barns and creeks. But even in its imperfection, it pulsed with potential. Small towns, once quiet and out of the way, began to feel the stirrings of change. In places like Galena, Kansas, or Carthage, Missouri, shop owners repainted their storefronts. Gas pumps were repaired. Diners opened their doors early and stayed open late because the travelers were coming. Not all at once, but steadily. Tire by tire, engine by engine, the rhythm of Route 66 began to echo across America. There was something different about this road. It didn't follow the usual stiff grid of east to west logic. It angled, it meandered, it connected. From the Great Lakes to the deserts, through cities and ghost towns, this road wasn't just functional. It felt personal. It was the kind of road where you might pass through a town and see a child waving from a porch, a farmer tipping his hat, or a neon sign flickering to life as twilight settled in. The Mother Road, as it would later be called, was born not from speed, but from story, and it gave rise to many. There were the truck drivers hauling oranges westward and bringing steel back east. There were newlyweds heading toward California with a car full of hope and a few dollars tucked under the visor. There were drifters, musicians, day laborers, all bound together by the same stretch of road, chasing something better, or simply chasing the horizon. And yet, for all its promise, Route 66 still had a long way to go. Much of the early road was rough, especially through Oklahoma and New Mexico, where paved sections gave way to dirt paths that turned to mud in the rain and dust in the summer heat. But people didn't seem to mind, because even when the road was bumpy, it was theirs. Something real, something they could follow, not just to another place, but to a new version of themselves. By the end of the 1920s, thousands of people had driven portions of the route. They stayed in tiny motels with flashing signs and ate at lunch counters where the coffee was strong and the stories even stronger. For the communities along the way, Route 66 became a lifeline. It brought business, travelers, news, and connection. It made the small feel seen. And for those on the move, it became more than a road. It became a compass, a long, winding promise that, no matter where you started, you could find a way forward. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was identity. By the early 1930s, the government began improving the route, laying down more pavement, smoothing turns, and replacing old bridges. But long before the asphalt was perfected, the spirit of the road had already taken hold. Children growing up near it would sit by their windows, counting cars. Store owners learned the names of repeat travelers. And for the first time, many Americans began to understand that the road beneath their wheels could also be the one that led to their dreams. It's hard to say exactly when Route 66 shifted from utility to legend, but if you ask those who remember, many would point back to those early days, when a dusty car pulled into town and brought with it the unknown. And so, by the time John Steinbeck would write about it, and Nat King Cole would sing of it, The road had already made its mark. Quietly, faithfully, mile by mile, the mother road had begun, and soon it would carry not just travelers, but an entire nation through some of its darkest, dustiest days. In the early 1930s, the wind began to change. Not just a breeze, but a howling, restless wind that swept across the Great Plains, lifting the earth itself into the sky. The soil, once rich and rooted, turned to dust, fine, choking, relentless. This was the Dust Bowl. And for hundreds of thousands of Americans, it marked the end of everything they knew and the beginning of a long road west. Their farms had failed. Their crops had withered. The rain had stopped falling, and the banks came knocking with notices, not compassion. They packed what little they had, tools, mattresses, kitchenware, onto trucks that coughed and rattled down dirt roads. The kids rode up front or clung to whatever space was left. A baby's crib might be tied on with rope. A dog might follow behind, unsure but loyal. And on the dashboard, a folded map, hastily drawn or carefully marked, pointed them toward hope. That hope had a name: Route 66, from Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Arkansas. They followed the old mother road toward California, a place whispered about in town halls and kitchen tables, where oranges grew year-round and jobs were said to be waiting in the fields. Each family had their own reason. Some were chasing work. Some were chasing warmth. Some were simply running from the memory of what they had lost. They became known as Okies, though many weren't from Oklahoma. The name stuck, worn like a second skin, used in judgment, in headlines, and sometimes cruelly, on signs that read, "No Okies, no jobs, no hope." But still, they traveled, and Route 66 carried them. Not gently, but steadily, mile after mile. Along the way, the road became more than just a path. It became a witness. It watched mothers soothe crying babies as dust slipped through the cracks of every window. It watched fathers tighten belts another notch, not from fashion, but hunger. It watched children grow quiet too early in life, their laughter packed away with the family china. The cars broke down often, tires wore thin, water ran low, and yet there was always a sense of forward. For those families, there was no going back. The land behind them was dry, broken, but the land ahead, somehow, still shimmered. They camped by the roadside, cooked beans over fires, washed their clothes in creeks. Sometimes, a stranger would wave them in, offer a plate of eggs or a place to sleep under a barn roof. Other times, they were turned away, met with suspicion, resentment, even hate. But the road did not judge. It held their stories in silence. It carved their journey across the heart of America, and it gave them something priceless: direction. By 1936, hundreds of thousands had made the journey. Entire makeshift communities sprung up outside California towns, tent cities, crowded orchards, labor camps. The work was hard. The pay was poor. But at least they weren't being buried in dust anymore. For many, Route 66 was the first glimpse of mountains, the first taste of oranges fresh from the grove, the first time they'd seen the Pacific. It was a road of pain, yes, but also of possibility. Writers like John Steinbeck took notice. His novel, The Grapes of Wrath, would later call Route 66 the Mother Road, a name born not from pride, but from endurance. Because like any mother, the road had held the weight of its children, and it had carried them, even when the journey hurt. When we look back now at the old black and white photos of dust-covered trucks and tired faces, it's easy to see only struggle, but there was strength there too. A quiet, stubborn strength that didn't ask for pity, only for a chance. And Route 66 gave them that. It became a symbol, not just of migration, but of survival. So many of the towns along the highway remember that time. The descendants of those travelers still live in the valleys and hills they arrived in all those decades ago. And somewhere, etched deep in the pavement or hanging quietly on a diner wall, is a memory of the ones who came through, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. As the road bends westward toward the next chapter, it carries with it the soft footprints of a generation who kept moving through wind, dust, and doubt, because they believed somehow that better days waited just around the bend. As the dust continued to blow and the wheels kept turning westward, the story of Route 66 found its place, not just in maps and memories, but in the pages of American literature, and no story captured its soul more deeply than The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. John Steinbeck's masterpiece did something that few books ever truly accomplish. It gave a voice to the voiceless, and in doing so, it etched Route 66 into the conscience of a nation. Steinbeck never meant to romanticize the road. He didn't dress it in neon or wrap it in glory. Instead, he portrayed it as it was during those hard Depression years. A pathway of pain, perseverance, and quiet dignity. In his words, Route 66 was more than a route. It was the Mother Road, the line that mothers and fathers and children followed, not for luxury or leisure, but for survival. He wrote of families who had lost everything, homes repossessed, land swallowed by dust, dreams turned brittle in the heat, and yet they packed what was left into rusted-out cars and rumbled west, mile by dusty mile, along this weathered ribbon of hope. Steinbeck's characters, the Joad family, became stand-ins for thousands of real people. Ordinary Americans with calloused hands, empty wallets, and stubborn hearts, as they journeyed across the plains and deserts, through the blistering heat and weary towns. The reader traveled with them, not just physically, but emotionally. You could feel the grit in their teeth, the ache in their backs, the silence of worry that settled between husband and wife, and always, Route 66 was there, stretching ahead like a question mark across the horizon. It wasn't paved with promise. It wasn't kind, but it was there. The road didn't ask for credentials. It didn't turn anyone away. It simply waited for the next overloaded truck, the next crying child, the next pair of hopeful eyes staring out toward California. What Steinbeck captured was the truth of the road, its hard shoulders, its tired motels, its sunburnt gas station clerks, its roadside graves. But he also captured its quiet majesty. Because for all the suffering, Route 66 was a chance, a narrow bridge between despair and something better. And that's what gave it power. It became a symbol in American storytelling, not just of physical travel, but of inner transformation. A road where identities shifted, where dignity was tested, where the very soul of a person was laid bare under the burning sky. In classrooms across America, The Grapes of Wrath is still read today. And when students trace the Jode's journey across Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and into California, they're not just following fictional footsteps. They're retracing the history of their country, one where people moved not for riches, but for dignity. One where a broken-down car on Route 66 carried more humanity than a mansion ever could. Even now, decades later, the name Mother Road lingers, not just because Steinbeck coined it, but because people felt it. It was a road that bore the weight of a generation, a road that watched fathers grow old before their time, and mothers teach their children to stay hopeful even when the cupboards were bare. A road that became a chapter in the story of America's resilience. And though the world has changed, though the cars are faster, the roads wider, the destinations different, something in those pages, in that story, still feels familiar because the search for something better is timeless, and the roads we take to get there still shape who we become. As the story of Route 66 continued, through diners and drive-ins, through wars and wonder, through neon lights and faded maps, the spirit of the Grapes of Wrath remained tucked beneath it all, a reminder that for many, Route 66 was not a vacation. It was a lifeline, a last chance, a prayer whispered through the exhaust of a tired old truck heading west. And somewhere between the turning pages and the turning wheels, America found a piece of itself, dusted, bruised, but unbroken. After the last page of the Grapes of Wrath had been turned, after the dust settled behind the westbound trucks, there remained the quieter, softer side of Route 66, a place where the journey paused for a bite to eat, where neon signs flickered gently in the twilight, and where weary travelers found rest, not in grand hotels, but in tiny, hand-painted motels built with hope, grit, and a porch light left on. This was the roadside life of Route 66, a world unto itself, one that lived just a few steps off the pavement and just a few heartbeats away from home. You'd know it when you saw it. The pastel colors of a 1950s diner, the smell of sizzling bacon drifting out through the screen door, the creak of a metal stool at the counter, and a waitress named Betty or Doris calling you honey before asking if you wanted coffee with your pie. These weren't chains. These weren't franchises. They were family places, built by moms and pops, often with their kids sweeping the floors or refilling napkin holders. Some were no more than 10 stools and a grill. Others had vinyl booths, jukeboxes glowing in the corner, and windows that let in the gold orange of a desert evening. Every one of them had stories, stories told in faded photographs above the register, in the grooves worn into the floor by trucker boots, in the chalkboard specials that hadn't changed in years. And when the sun dipped low, the motels came alive. Each one had its own name, sometimes proud, sometimes peculiar. The Stardust Inn, Desert Breeze Motel, Sleepy Bear Lodge. Some rooms had star-shaped mirrors or pink tile bathrooms. Others had nothing but a bed, a fan, and a Gideon Bible. But to those who pulled in late, dust-coated and road-weary, they were a godsend. The owner might greet you in slippers. Their dog might bark from behind the office door. A neon vacancy sign buzzed gently outside, and the ice machine rattled just once as it started up. There was a rhythm to it all, a softness, a kind of humble hospitality that made you feel like the world had paused for a moment. Just for you. And then there were the signs, those glorious, oversized, painted signs that dotted the highway like lighthouses for the hungry, the tired, and the curious. Eat here. It's good. Rooms with refrigeration. Free color TV. They promised the simple luxuries that now seem quaint. But back then, they were enough to pull a car off the road. Kids pressed their faces to the windows, watching for the next giant hot dog statue or winking cowboy. Parents scanned the map, figuring out how many miles to go before the next milkshake. Route 66 wasn't just a highway, it was a corridor of comfort. And the roadside culture, those diners and motels, those neon signs and family businesses, formed the connective tissue of the experience. For thousands of Americans, these places weren't just stops. They were moments where laughter echoed over pie and coffee, where parents kissed sunburned foreheads goodnight, where new memories were made with every slow mile. Even now, long after the interstates have pulled most travelers away, you can still find remnants of that life. Some diners still open at 6 a.m. sharp, with cracked linoleum floors and coffee pots older than most of their customers. Some motels still light their neon proudly, even if the paint is peeling. And some towns, forgotten by most, still cling to the rhythms of the roadside, as if refusing to let go of the way things used to be. Because that was always the magic of Route 66, not in the destination, but in the stops along the way, in the woman who served your eggs just right, in the man who fixed your tire without charging you, in the kid who waved at your car from the porch of a motor court as your family drove past. That's the part of Route 66 that never made the headlines, but it made the memories. As we continue down the road, the glow of a neon sign fades in the rearview mirror. And ahead lies another chapter, one not of comfort, but caution. A reminder that for some, this road held different rules. Let's take a look at the other side of Route 66, where travel wasn't always safe, and not every door was open. As the neon signs blinked in warm welcome, and the scent of grilled onions danced through the dry desert air, there was another truth, quietly running beneath the rhythm of the road. Not every traveler on Route 66 was welcome everywhere they stopped. For white families, the journey west might have meant adventure, leisure, and the soft shuffle of postcards in a roadside shop. But for Black Americans, especially in the 1930s through the 1960s, travel often came with tension, caution, and a quiet fear that the next town might not be safe. The open road promised freedom, but that freedom wasn't given equally. Hotels that turned folks away at the door, gas stations that refused to serve, restaurants with locked doors or hostile stares, and entire counties where a Black traveler was warned, explicitly or otherwise, not to be caught after dark. These weren't just stories. They were realities, painfully common, quietly lived, and rarely spoken aloud, which is why the Negro Motorist Green Book became a lifeline. First published in 1936 by Victor Hugo Green, a Black postal worker from Harlem, the Green Book was more than a travel guide. It was a shield, a survival tool, a carefully compiled list of hotels, restaurants, service stations, and homes across America where Black travelers could expect safety, or at least not hostility. For those traveling Route 66, the Green Book was essential. A trusted copy might rest on the dashboard, pages folded, underlined, worn soft at the edges from being read again and again. Families would plan entire trips around it, choosing not the fastest or most scenic route, but the safest. There were safe havens, modest motels tucked behind churches, cafes with small back entrances, private homes that took guests by word of mouth, sometimes just one or two places in an entire state, sometimes none. And yet people traveled. They drove through Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all the way to California, not because the road was easy, but because the journey still mattered, because they too had dreams. Route 66 is remembered for its romance, its freedom, and its myth. But this too was part of its truth, a mother clutching her child tighter in an unfamiliar town, a father scanning the rearview mirror, not just for directions, but for danger, a family choosing peanut butter sandwiches over diner meals because the diner wouldn't open its door. And still, they created joy along the way. They found laughter at the picnic table behind a friendly gas station. They sang together as the miles rolled on. They built memories, beautiful, complex, and real. These stories aren't always carved into roadside monuments. You won't see them in postcards. But they live on, in quiet voices passed down through generations, in photographs tucked into family Bibles, in the resilience it took to move, to believe, to claim a piece of the American road. And it wasn't just black travelers. Many people of color, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, faced similar challenges on the road, each with their own quiet strategies for navigating a world that offered freedom with one hand and withheld it with the other. Over time, the civil rights movement began to shift the tide. By the late 1960s, anti-discrimination laws began to erode the legal foundations of segregation, but the memories remained. And for many families, the habits of caution and careful planning lingered long after the laws changed. Today, travelers may stop at a refurbished motel, sip a milkshake at a retro-themed diner, and pose with Route 66 signs as symbols of a bygone era. But the full story of Route 66 isn't just in the chrome and neon. It's in the tension that lived between the lines, in the strength it took to travel anyway, and in the dignity of those who claimed the road, mile by uncertain mile. Because even on the mother road, not every mother could rest easy. Still, the journey continued, and in the next chapter of Route 66's long life, a new kind of traveler would fill the lanes. Young men in uniform, convoys of trucks, a nation at war, and once again, Route 66 would rise to serve a new purpose. Let's keep going. By the early 1940s, Route 66 had already become a steady thread across the American landscape, a path of promise and movement, lined with diners, gas pumps, and dusty hopes. But when war came, quiet at first, then roaring, everything changed. In December of 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the nation was thrust into World War II. And just like that, Route 66 was no longer just a road for dreamers and travelers. It became a road for soldiers, for supplies, for sacrifice. The neon sign stayed lit, but the mood had shifted. The jukeboxes still played, but beneath the melodies, something deeper hummed. Urgency, duty, resolve. Factories across the country were repurposed for the war effort. Towns along Route 66, once sleepy or simply passing places, now found themselves at the heart of military logistics. In places like Tulsa, Albuquerque, and Barstow, defense plants and training bases sprouted up. Barracks replaced barns. Convoys replaced caravans. The road pulsed with a new kind of traffic. Trucks hauling ammunition, tanks and food. Buses filled with young men in uniform, staring quietly out the window, not knowing where they were going or if they'd return. For many, Route 66 was the last stretch of American soil they'd see before shipping out west toward the Pacific. A final memory of home. They passed roadside diners still open, but now offering rationed menus. They saw familiar motels, but with blackout curtains and stricter hours. They wrote letters at gas station counters, leaned against payphones to whisper goodbyes, and carried pictures of loved ones deep in their coat pockets. Back home, wives, sisters, and mothers took up jobs at those very factories along the route, assembling engines, welding metal, folding parachutes. Route 66 became a shared artery for effort. It carried not just soldiers, but the spirit of unity, of every person doing their part. And as the war stretched on, so did the roll of the road. In Arizona and New Mexico, portions of Route 66 were used for testing military vehicles. Near Los Alamos, hidden behind mesas and guarded gates, scientists used side roads off the route to quietly change the course of history. Route 66 carried secrets, some heavy with science, others simply made of love and longing. It was a time of blackouts, ration books, and gas stamps, of victory gardens sprouting behind motels, of flags hung in windows, blue stars for sons away, gold stars for those who never returned. And yet, amid the gravity of war, there were still small moments. A young soldier might pause at a roadside stand for a root beer. A bus of recruits might break down and find themselves welcomed into a town with sandwiches and pie. Letters were postmarked from places like Winslow or Kingman, telling mothers, "I'm okay. The sun is hot. I miss home." For Route 66, these years became a new chapter, not one of carefree travel, but of national service. The Mother Road earned her name again, not just as a path across America, but as a lifeline during its darkest hours. She bore the weight of war and didn't buckle, and when the war finally ended in 1945, many of those same soldiers came home along that same road. But this time, they weren't headed to battle. They were coming home, to front porches, to family dinners, to new beginnings. Some would load their young families into used Chevys and take to Route 66 once again, this time not with helmets and duffel bags, but with picnic baskets and Polaroid cameras. Because while Route 66 helped win a war, it would soon help build something just as important: peace. In the years that followed, the road would come alive with family vacations, open convertibles, and a booming economy. But tucked behind every mile marker, in every fading photograph, the war years would remain. Quiet, honest, proud. And so, Route 66 kept rolling, its pavement marked not only by wheels, but by memory. Coming up next, we move into a different kind of America, one filled with optimism, prosperity, and a hunger for movement. As families took to the road not out of necessity, but out of joy. By the time the war had ended and the boys came home, America was ready to breathe again. The factories slowed. The silence returned. But this time, it wasn't hollow. It was hopeful. And Route 66, she waited. The road that once carried soldiers to war now welcomed families chasing peace. From 1945 into the booming 1950s, Route 66 entered her golden age, a time when wheels rolled not for duty, but for joy. Gas was cheap, cars were big, dreams were bigger. Across the country, families packed their trunks with picnic baskets, lawn chairs, and battered suitcases. Fathers in white t-shirts, mothers with sunglasses and scarves tied beneath their chins, kids leaning against rolled-down windows, hair flying wild in the wind. The open road became a rite of passage. There were no smartphones, no GPS, just a folded road atlas in the glove compartment and a sense of adventure humming in every mile. And for so many, the journey west meant one thing: Route 66. The mother road turned into the heartbeat of the family vacation. She led them through Missouri's rolling hills, Oklahoma's red dirt, the vast deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. And at the end of it all, if you drove far enough, was California and Disneyland. But the magic wasn't just at the destination. It was in the motels shaped like teepees, the drive-in diners where milkshakes arrived in tin cups. It was in the colored postcards you mailed from Amarillo, the plastic dashboard souvenirs. It was the way your dad drove with one hand on the wheel, and your mom sang along with the radio. It was your little brother falling asleep in the back seat, legs curled beneath him, sunburnt and sticky with root beer. There was a rhythm to it all, a slow-moving melody of motion and memory. Every few hours you'd pull over, not because you had to, but because you could. To stretch your legs, to walk into a gift shop, to take a silly photograph by a giant jackrabbit or a roadside dinosaur. Route 66 turned America into a living map of roadside wonder. And for the kids who rode those back seats, the road became a world all its own. They didn't always know where they were, but they knew it smelled like gasoline and bubble gum. They knew the sun hit different in Arizona, that the nights in New Mexico were full of stars so wide it felt like space was folding in around you. And the radio, oh, the radio, AM stations drifting in and out as the car moved across states, each signal crackling with country, swing, rock and roll. Somewhere along the route, you'd hear it. Get your kicks on Route 66. And suddenly, the car got a little louder, the smiles a little wider. Route 66 was no longer just a line on the map. She was part of the family story. In those boom years, travel wasn't luxury. It was bonding. A moment when the family became a unit again after the separations of war. A father seeing the country he fought for. A mother holding a camera and trying to freeze time. Children collecting experiences like seashells. The road offered more than just scenery. It offered belonging and freedom, not the kind earned in battle, but the quiet kind found in roadside diners and tourist stops. Every mile felt like discovery. Every motel room felt like a tiny home, and every goodbye to a town left behind felt a little like leaving a piece of yourself there. It was a time when movement wasn't just possible, it was encouraged. A time when the American dream rode on 4 wheels, beneath a striped awning, with a cooler full of sandwiches in the trunk. And yet, even in that joy, there was always a whisper, something soft in the background, reminding you that nothing lasts forever. But in the 1950s, Route 66 was alive, alive with laughter, with heat, with momentum, alive with families making memories they wouldn't realize were precious until decades later. It was a golden hour in America's travel story, where the sun set slow behind the windshield and everyone in the car watched together. Coming up next, the road continues into pop culture. A jingle, a television show, and a song that would make Route 66 more than a highway. It would become an icon. By the time the 1950s gave way to the early 60s, Route 66 had become something more than asphalt and painted lines. It was a mood, a rhythm, a backdrop to America's most hopeful dreams and widest highways of imagination. It made its way into the soul of the country, not just by wheels on pavement, but by melody on radio waves. In 1946, as the dust of war settled and Americans looked westward with hope in their hearts, a young rhythm and blues artist named Bobby Troup wrote a song that would forever link Route 66 to America's cultural identity. He didn't just write about cities, Flagstaff, Arizona, don't forget Winona. He wrote about movement, about possibility, about the kind of journey that isn't just physical, but emotional. Get your kicks on Route 66. That line wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise, and people listened. Nat King Cole made it smooth. Chuck Berry made it swing. The Rolling Stones made it roll. With each version, the road stretched further, not just across states, but across oceans and generations. It became more than a route. It became a feeling. Radio stations from Illinois to California played the tune like a highway hymn, and soon, Route 66 was pulsing in diners, jukeboxes, and car speakers from coast to coast. Teenagers danced to it. Truckers sang it through cracked windows. Families hummed it as they pulled into motels lit by flickering neon. The song gave Route 66 a new kind of life, a life of music, motion, and myth. But music wasn't the only place Route 66 made its mark. In 1960, a television show premiered that would carry the road straight into American living rooms, simply titled Route 66. The show followed two young men, Todd and Buzz, in a Corvette convertible, traveling the open road in search of meaning, odd jobs, and a sense of place. Each episode was filmed on location, showcasing real towns, real people, and the everyday grit of America. Though the characters changed from episode to episode, the star was always the same: the road itself. Through the screen, viewers tasted the dust of New Mexico, glimpsed the diners of Missouri, and felt the loneliness of long highways stretching through Arizona. The show was less about drama and more about discovery, a quiet kind of reflection tucked inside the American landscape. And for many who watched from couches in small towns or cramped city apartments, Route 66 became not just entertainment, but escape. A vision of freedom painted in black and white, where each mile marker hinted at reinvention. Even those who had never driven the route began to recognize the signs, the logo, the shape of the shield. It was everywhere. On record sleeves, souvenir mugs, t-shirts, matchbooks. Route 66 had crossed over, from highway to household name, from practical path to pop culture myth. It became shorthand for a certain kind of American spirit, the one that still believed in wide open spaces and second chances, the one that still found poetry in filling up a gas tank and heading west. And yet, through all its fame and flair, The soul of Route 66 remained humble. It wasn't the glitz of Hollywood or the rush of Broadway. It was the quiet clap of boots on gravel, the steady thrum of tires down a 2-lane stretch, the way a simple melody could echo in your head for years. Get your kicks, the phrase lingered, not because of marketing, but because it meant something. It meant that somewhere out there, between the city lights and the desert winds, was a place where you could still be free, still be yourself, still find a diner booth where the waitress called you Han and refilled your coffee without asking. Route 66, through song and screen, had given Americans something priceless, a sense of belonging to the journey, even if they'd never left home. And even now, if you listen closely, that melody still plays. Somewhere out there, under the crackle of a vintage AM station, or from a jukebox hidden in a quiet corner of a roadside cafe, you might hear it again, just enough to remind you that the road never really ended. It just changed shape. And now, as we round the next bend in our story, the music softens. The road gets crowded. And not every memory is golden. Let's move gently onward into the growing noise and weight of success, and what happens when a beloved road must face its own limits. As the 1960s unfolded, Route 66 was no longer just a symbol of freedom and discovery. It had become a thoroughfare of the masses. What was once a ribbon of adventure winding through quiet towns and endless plains had grown crowded, burdened by the very popularity it had inspired. Families from every corner of America now loaded up their station wagons and hit the road, dreaming of desert sunsets and the Pacific Ocean. But they weren't alone. Thousands of vehicles, cars, trucks, trailers, poured onto the mother road daily. The traffic that once gave the towns life was beginning to choke them. Motels that once had vacancies now filled up before noon. Diners struggled to keep up with the lines that curled around the block. Gas stations, once places for a neighborly chat, became pressure points of impatience and fatigue. Towns like Gallup, Barstow, and Amarillo saw their streets swell with bumper-to-bumper congestion during peak travel seasons. And with the increase in traffic came a steep rise in accidents. Route 66, for all its charm, had not been designed for this kind of volume. Many stretches were still narrow 2-lane roads, winding through sharp curves and blind hills. There were no shoulders, no medians, no place to safely pull over when things went wrong. And they often did. Head-on collisions became more common. Cars would overheat in the desert sun. Breakdowns blocked long stretches of road. Emergency services were scarce, sometimes hours away. For those behind the wheel, the journey could quickly turn from thrilling to terrifying. Locals began to notice the change. What had once been the steady hum of travelers bringing life to their small towns was now a constant roar. There was no break, no quiet season, no off switch. Even the neon lights began to feel tired, flickering under the weight of overuse, overwork, and overexposure. And beneath the surface, something else was changing too. The very spirit of Route 66. The soul of slow travel, of meandering discovery, was being tested by a culture that was beginning to value speed over story, efficiency over experience. The journey was becoming less about the moments between places and more about getting there fast. Gasoline companies pushed for wider roads. Automobile manufacturers dreamed of higher speeds. Travelers wanted shorter routes and smoother rides. and the government was listening. Whispers of a new highway system began to circulate, one that would bypass the small towns, cut through the landscape with engineered precision, and eliminate the delays, detours, and danger. But for now, Route 66 bore the weight of too many cars, too many accidents, too many dreams crowded into a road that was never built to hold them all. And still, there were moments when, just past a traffic jam or behind a long line of tail lights, a traveler might look out and see the sun dipping below the mesas, or stop for a milkshake and find themselves in a booth where stories still lived in the cracks of the Formica counter. The road hadn't lost its magic, but it was harder to hear above the engine noise. In some places, the congestion brought strange beauty, a kind of chaotic harmony where strangers bonded over flat tires and overheated radiators. In others, it brought weariness, frustration, accidents that lingered long after the wreckage had been cleared. And so, by the late 1960s, the writing was on the wall, or more precisely, on the maps. The United States was preparing for something bigger, faster, a new system of highways designed not with nostalgia in mind, but with speed, security, and national infrastructure. It wasn't a betrayal of Route 66, but it was a goodbye waiting to happen as we prepare to turn that next page in the journey toward the promise of the interstates and the fading of a beloved road. Let us pause here, on this stretch of Route 66, where the dreams and the dangers collided, where traffic replaced solitude, where change crept in, mile by mile, until the road itself felt different. Let us remember that even a highway can be overwhelmed by its own legend, and from here, we gently continue. Next comes a vision, one born not of romance, but of order. A system that would redefine how Americans moved, and in doing so, quietly relegate the mother road to memory. Change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like the rumble of tires on a newer road, faster, smoother, and less forgiving of the past. By the mid-1950s, Route 66 was bursting at the seams. Congestion clogged its narrow lanes. Accidents were on the rise. Families seeking adventure found themselves caught in long lines of brake lights and frustration. And in the eyes of the nation's leaders, the road was no longer a symbol of freedom, but a bottleneck to progress. Then came a man with a vision. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, no stranger to logistics, no stranger to the power of infrastructure, had seen firsthand the efficiency of Germany's Autobahn during World War II. He returned home with an idea. America needed its own modern highway system, one built not on whimsy or wanderlust, but on purpose, on speed, on safety. And so, in 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, a bill that would change the face of American travel forever. Across the nation, concrete began to pour. Highways stretched like arteries from coast to coast, wide and efficient, bypassing the small towns that once pulsed with the rhythm of passing travelers. The interstate highway system was born. It was everything. Route 66 wasn't. 4 lanes instead of 2. Divided medians for safety. No stoplights, no sharp curves through downtowns, no diners with checkered floors, no neon signs buzzing in the night, no reason to slow down and stay a while. To some, it felt like progress. To others, like the beginning of a quiet goodbye. In towns from Missouri to New Mexico, business owners stood on their porches and watched as the traffic disappeared. Not all at once, but steadily, like a faucet turning off drip by drip. Gas stations went empty. Motels lost their charm without guests to fill their rooms. The hum of America on the move had shifted. Just a few miles over, what Eisenhower saw as efficiency, many locals experienced as abandonment. And yet, there was no denying the interstates were safer. They saved lives. They connected cities with unprecedented ease. They kept goods flowing, people moving, and dreams within reach. But in their speed, something was lost. A sense of discovery, the unplanned stop, the chance conversation at a roadside cafe, the slow unraveling of the landscape, one gentle mile at a time. Route 66 was never built to compete with the future. It was built to connect, to carry workers west, to reunite families, to offer refuge during the Dust Bowl and hope during wartime. But in a world obsessed with getting there faster, it began to fade. Still, the Mother Road did not vanish overnight. For a time, the old and the new ran alongside each other. Route 66 weaving under and over the interstate, stubborn as memory. Some travelers still chose the scenic route, drawn not by efficiency, but by experience. They sought out the odd-shaped motels, the hand-painted signs, the slices of pie served with a wink. They weren't just passing through. They were returning to something, but the writing was on the wall and on the maps. Section by section, Route 66 was bypassed, replaced, or reclassified. The signs came down. The mile markers changed. And slowly, one of America's most iconic highways was no longer a road, but a relic. Still, something lingered, a whisper in the wind as you pass a boarded-up gas station, a postcard tucked into a thrift store book, a song on the radio that makes you want to roll down the windows and chase something you can't quite name. Progress moved on. But Route 66, she stayed. Not on the main roads, perhaps, but in the hearts of those who remembered what it meant to take your time. To find beauty, not at the destination, but somewhere just after the last bend in the road. And as we prepare to say goodbye to the official maps and signs, let us not say goodbye to the road itself. Because next, we enter the era of farewell, of decommissioned highways, falling neon, and towns left behind. But first, let's linger a moment longer here, where the old road still meets the new, where Eisenhower's vision met resistance, and change met memory. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but with the soft ache of nostalgia for a road that once carried the soul of a country. The end didn't come with a bang. There was no grand ceremony, no crowds gathered at the roadside, no brass band to play it out. Instead, it happened the way most endings do, quietly, piece by piece, mile by mile, a fading of importance, a quiet removal from the map. In 1985, the United States government officially decommissioned Route 66. That meant it was no longer recognized as part of the federal highway system, no longer maintained, no longer necessary. Its signs came down. Some pulled quietly in the early morning hours, others left to rust until wind or time carried them away. And the places those signs once led to, they grew quieter too. In towns from Arizona to Illinois, residents looked around and wondered what had happened. What had changed? When, exactly, the last car had passed through without stopping. There was no single moment of death. But for many, the decommissioning felt like the final breath of something beautiful, something that had lived and breathed for generations. To decommission Route 66 was to close a chapter, not just in infrastructure, but in the emotional geography of a nation. Because Route 66 had been more than asphalt and mile markers. It had been a lifeline, a journey, a symbol of freedom, reinvention, and motion, and now it was gone. Some saw it coming. Years before the official decision, parts of the road had already been bypassed or renamed. Drivers no longer needed to wind through small towns when the new interstates offered straight shots and higher speeds. Route 66 had become inconvenient, outdated, and in a country racing toward the future, there was little time to mourn what was being left behind. But for those who had grown up along its path, for the motels and diners and gas stations whose lives were once tied to the rhythm of passing cars, it wasn't just about traffic. It was about identity, about belonging, about the sound of a bell over a cafe door, the smell of fresh coffee and motor oil, the flicker of neon coming to life at dusk. Now, those same neon signs blinked into silence. The coffee pots went cold, and the road that had carried millions was left to weeds, wind, and memory. It was the end of an era, the closing of a window into mid-century America, a time when families packed into station wagons, maps folded on their laps, and pointed west not because they had to, but because they could. The mother road, once full of promise, escape, and adventure, was no longer a part of the official story. But even then, even after the decommissioning, something curious began to happen. People began to feel its absence, not just in traffic patterns, but in the heart, because you can erase a line from a map, but you cannot erase it from memory. And Route 66 had lived in the memory of too many. For them, the road wasn't gone. It was sleeping, waiting for a new generation to ask, what was it like? Waiting for someone to walk into a dusty visitor center and pick up a postcard with Route 66 stamped across the front. Waiting for an old photo to fall from a family scrapbook, showing smiling faces by a curved motel sign. Waiting for a song, just a few chords, to bring it all rushing back. In that way, Route 66 never really ended. It simply transformed, from pavement to myth, from wayfinding to wondering. It became part of the soul of the country. So while the signs may have been taken down, and the road no longer received federal funding, its spirit remained etched into the bones of America. And as we move forward into the next chapter, into ghost towns and forgotten gas pumps, we carry with us this quiet farewell. A farewell not just to a road, but to a time, to a feeling, to a rhythm of life that once pulsed beneath the rubber of Goodyears and Firestones. Route 66 may have been decommissioned, but in the minds of those who remember, it was never truly closed. It simply turned off the lights and waited patiently in the dark for someone to come back and turn them on again. The cars stopped coming, one by one. The headlights that once rolled down Main Street disappeared. The sound of tires crunching over gravel, the jingle of a service station bell, the laughter spilling out of diners at twilight. All of it faded into silence. What Route 66 left behind wasn't just old road signs or broken neon. It left behind entire towns, places that once thrived with the rhythm of the mother road. Now, still, somewhere along the line, after the interstates opened and the maps were redrawn, the pulse of these little places was quietly turned off. No announcement, no news article, just a slow, steady forgetting. In Galena, Kansas, in Glen Rio, Texas, in Amboy, California. You can still find them if you go looking. Buildings leaning gently with time, gas pumps rusted in place like statues of another age, curtains fluttering in windows that haven't welcomed a guest in decades. Once, these towns were full of life. Tourists snapped pictures under painted motel signs. Kids ran barefoot between screen doors and soda machines. A jukebox might have played Patsy Cline while a family ate cheeseburgers under fluorescent lights. And now, silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy sort. The kind that feels like waiting. As if the buildings themselves still expect someone to walk through the door. Some towns were born because of Route 66. Others survived because of it. When the road was removed from the federal system, that lifeline vanished overnight. Businesses closed, families left, the lights went out, and yet something remains, a kind of ghost. Not frightening, but aching. A whisper of what used to be. You might hear it in the creak of an old sign swaying in the wind. You might see it in the faded lettering of a long-shut cafe. Best coffee for 100 miles. You might feel it as you step into the emptiness and realize this place once mattered. And to some, it still does. Because there's beauty in these ghost towns, not in spite of their decay, but because of it. Every peeling paint chip, every cracked sidewalk, every sun-bleached billboard, they tell a story, not of failure, but of passing, of a country that changed its path, and in doing so, left something sacred behind. These towns didn't vanish because they did something wrong. They vanished because the world moved on, because faster became better, because 4-lane highways didn't have room for slow diners, hand-painted signs, or stoplights that blinked yellow into the dark. Still, some people return, photographers, travelers, dreamers. They come not just to see, but to feel. To stand still in a world that rarely allows it, to breathe in the dust and remember that America was once a little quieter, a little closer, a little kinder. These ghost towns are museums without entry fees. Their exhibits? A payphone with no dial tone, a room key still hanging on a hook, a postcard taped to a cracked mirror, yellowed, unread, unsent, and somehow in all that stillness you hear it. The hum of what Route 66 once was. The cars may never return. The motels may never reopen. But these places, these pauses in the present, still carry the heartbeat of an older America. They remind us that some things are worth preserving. Not because they're useful, not because they're modern, but because they're meaningful. And so, as we leave these towns behind, we do so gently, not with pity, but with reverence. They are not failures. They are memorials to a road that once brought millions of people exactly where they needed to go, even if they didn't know where that was. And as we move forward toward restoration, toward memory, toward hope, these ghost towns stay behind like open hands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be loved, and maybe, one day, waiting to live again. The silence didn't last forever. For a time, it seemed like Route 66 would simply fade, disappear beneath weeds, weather, and the widening shadows of time. But America doesn't always forget its roads, especially not one that carried so many memories. In the quiet years after decommissioning, something unexpected began to stir. Not from government initiatives or corporate plans, but from people, ordinary people. People who had loved this road, who had grown up near it, who remembered it not just as a highway, but as a heartbeat. It began small. A coat of fresh paint on an old gas station in Shamrock, Texas. A neon sign repaired in Tucumcari, New Mexico. A forgotten diner scrubbed clean by a couple who decided it was too beautiful to let die. These weren't restorations for profit. They were labors of love. One motel owner, now in her 70s, said she stayed open not because the business was booming, but because I couldn't bear to turn off the light for the last time. Volunteers showed up from out of state, tools in hand. Artists turned boarded-up windows into murals that danced with color and memory. Historians combed through archives to protect forgotten places from being bulldozed into history's dustbin. They didn't ask for permission. They just did it. Because someone had to. Soon, travelers began returning. Not for speed, but for story. The myth of Route 66 was no longer enough. People wanted to see it, touch it, feel it beneath their tires. The revival of the Mother Road wasn't a grand relaunch. It was a grassroots resurrection, done with paintbrushes and pickup trucks, with memories and a stubborn kind of hope. In Arizona, preservation groups fought to save the wigwam motels, quirky, iconic, unmistakably Americana. In Missouri, civic groups lobbied to keep vintage signs lit, not for tourism dollars, but because they meant something to the town. In Oklahoma, the Route 66 Museum opened, not just with artifacts, but with heart. And everywhere, along the 2,448 miles of the old road, you could feel it, a pulse, small but steady. A reminder that while you can remove a road from the map, you can't erase it from the soul. There was a poetry in it all. How the very communities that had been left behind were the ones now leading the revival. It wasn't about nostalgia for its own sake. It was about honoring the lives once lived here. The waitress who served coffee for 30 years. The mechanic who patched tires and gave directions with a smile. The family that built their motel one cinder block at a time. It was about saying, we were here, we mattered, and we still do. In some places, you'll still find the rust and the rot. But beside them now, flowers bloom, windows shine, and the hum of traffic, gentler, slower, returns. These revival efforts didn't bring back the past. They protected it, made space for it to live alongside the present. And what's more, they taught us something essential. That preservation isn't about freezing time. It's about respecting it, tending to what remains with care, so that others can understand what once was and why it still matters. Route 66's rebirth didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in towns like Seligman, Arizona, where barbers became historians, and in Cuba, Missouri, where murals turned blank walls into windows to the past. It happened because someone looked at an old sign and said, "That's too beautiful to throw away." And someone else replied, "Then let's fix it." And so they did, and so they still do. The Mother Road lives on now, not just in memory, but in the hands of those who won't let go, who believe that heritage has value, that stories deserve a setting, that America's most legendary road still has something left to give. As the sun dips low and the shadows stretch long across the cracked pavement, there's a quiet pride in what remains, because every fresh coat of paint, every restored sign, every lit-up diner window isn't just preservation. It's a promise that the road will never be entirely lost, not as long as someone still cares enough to keep walking it, brush in hand, heart wide open. Even after the maps changed and the road signs came down, Route 66 never truly vanished. Something lingered. Something lived on. Not just in memories or museum glass, but in places you could still touch and still walk into, like stepping back into a dream you didn't realize you remembered. The revival of Route 66 wasn't just about restoring old signs or repainting rusty gas stations. It was about keeping Americana alive. The spirit, the quirk, the charm, and perhaps above all, the sense of wonder that once came with hitting the open road. Take Cadillac Ranch, for instance, just outside Amarillo, Texas, in a flat field kissed by wind and dust. 10 Cadillacs stand nose first in the earth, planted like crops of chrome and tail fins, each one covered in layers of graffiti, spray-painted love notes, declarations, doodles, and names that will fade only to be painted over again. It's absurd. It's brilliant. And it's exactly the kind of joyful oddity Route 66 became famous for. Further down the road, you might spot a muffler man, a towering fiberglass figure holding a tire, or maybe a hot dog, depending on where you are. These giants used to advertise car shops and cafes, but now they serve a greater purpose. They mark memory. They stand as guardians of roadside charm, waving silently to the cars that still pass by. Then there's the blue whale of Tulsa in Oklahoma. A gentle smile stretched across its painted face. The whale lounges by a pond like a roadside relic of a simpler summer. Built by a man for his wife and their children's delight, it once welcomed swimmers and dreamers. Today, it welcomes something else. Nostalgia, a longing not for spectacle, but for sincerity. And who could forget the wigwam motels? Sleep in a concrete teepee where mid-century travelers once lay under desert skies, and neon signs still flicker like they're whispering stories from the past. These aren't five-star attractions. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to be experienced, to be stumbled upon, to surprise you just enough to make you pull over, roll down the window, and smile. Each one tells a story, not just of where it is, but of when it came to be. They speak in the language of bygone road trips, camera rolls, and wide-eyed children in the back seat. What ties them all together is not polish or perfection, but personality. A kind of stubborn charm that refuses to be forgotten. Route 66 today is no longer a highway. It's a living museum, not the kind behind velvet ropes, but one you can drive through, photograph, and breathe in. These attractions aren't preserved because they're profitable. They're preserved because they matter, because someone remembered, and because someone decided to keep the porch light on for travelers still wandering the Mother Road. Across 8 states, From the flatlands of Illinois to the golden coast of California, these places shine like fireflies after sunset, flickering reminders that joy doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be real. And the people behind them? They're not curators or investors. They're waitresses who never stopped serving pie. They're mechanics who still keep one vintage pump running. They're couples who repaint a dinosaur every year just because it makes kids laugh. They do it for love, for history, for the way it feels when someone pulls up and says, "I used to come here when I was a kid," because that's the power of Route 66. It doesn't just take you somewhere. It takes you back to family road trips, to dripping ice cream cones, to postcards scribbled at roadside tables, to the warm hum of a motel TV and the smell of asphalt after summer rain. These attractions, odd and heartfelt, humble and human, are not just landmarks. They are anchors in time. They tether us to a version of America where the journey was the point, where every stop was a story, and where the road, however cracked or forgotten, still held the promise of something magical just around the bend. And so they shine on, not brightly, but warmly, not loudly, but lovingly, guiding the next traveler who dares to slow down and remember. Even after the neon signs began to dim and the traffic thinned to a whisper, Route 66 kept serving one thing that never went out of style. Comfort, not the kind you find in luxury or silence, but in the sound of a screen door creaking open, the scent of grilled onions wafting through a dusty parking lot, and the feel of a cold milkshake glass pressed between your hands on a sweltering summer afternoon. For generations of American families, Route 66 wasn't just a road. It was a dining table on wheels, a stretch of asphalt where the journey paused for pie, fries, and something warm that reminded you of home, even if you were 1,000 miles away from it. The roadside diners, burger shacks, and tiny family-run cafes didn't just offer food. They offered pause. They were moments of togetherness. A mother cutting a pancake into quarters for her youngest. A father sipping his coffee while circling motels in the AAA guidebook. Siblings arguing over jukebox songs between sips of strawberry shakes. The food itself was never fancy. It was always familiar, and that made it magic. A greasy burger wrapped in wax paper, crinkled fries salty enough to sting your fingertips, a slice of apple pie that tasted like someone actually peeled the apples that morning. These meals weren't about nutrition. They were about connection, about laughter echoing off tiled floors, about syrup spilled on maps, about stopping just long enough to make a memory. And they were everywhere. Along Route 66, towns like Seligman, Tucumcari, and Gallup became famous not for their skylines or monuments, but for their milkshakes, for their chili dogs, for the way they made you feel like you belonged the moment you walked in. There was something unspoken in those places. A nod from the waitress, a counter stool that always squeaked, a menu with 5 items and no need for more. And somewhere in the background, always, a jukebox humming Patsy Cline or Elvis, or a forgotten doo-wop tune that turned a simple meal into something cinematic. Children would press their noses to glass displays filled with pies. Truckers sat beside tourists without a single word exchanged. Yet somehow they shared something sacred, a break in the journey, and for every bite taken, there was a story. A birthday celebrated on the road. A fight forgotten over root beer floats. A marriage proposal that happened between bites of meatloaf. The food along Route 66 wasn't served on fine china, but it's plated in the memory of millions. Even today, in the diners that still flicker with neon light, you can find echoes of those days. A family pulling over just to say they'd been there. A retired couple reliving a honeymoon. A teenager discovering for the first time what a real milkshake tastes like. And behind the counter, often someone who remembers, who's been there since the days when cars lined up around the block, who knows how to make a grilled cheese the way your mom did, who might even slide you a second slice of pie on the house. It's in these small human gestures that the spirit of Route 66 stays alive. Not in monuments or museums, but in mugs of coffee refilled without asking, in ketchup bottles that have seen better days, in booths patched with duct tape and love, because what we remember most is not the food itself, but what it meant. It meant time. Time with the people we loved. Time to sit, to rest, to share. Time when the world slowed down enough to notice the taste of things. And maybe, just maybe, that's why those places still matter. They remind us that the road isn't always about going. Sometimes it's about stopping. And in that pause, in that diner, with that slice of pie and that song on the jukebox, you find something you didn't know you were missing. Not just a meal, but a moment. A memory. A piece of the American road that still tastes just like it used to. Some roads vanish quietly, swallowed by time, paved over, forgotten. But Route 66? It refused to disappear, even after the maps erased its name, even after the signs were taken down one by one, even after the final car turned away and silence returned to its shoulders. It lived on, in memories, in music, in rusted neon signs that still hum faintly under desert skies, because Route 66 was never just a highway. It was a thread sewn through the soul of America, a road that carried not only cars and cargo, but people, stories, and 1,000 dreams cradled in back seats and glove compartments. It was a lifeline for families fleeing dust and despair, a ribbon of hope for soldiers coming home, a path of adventure for restless teens and wide-eyed travelers chasing the sunset. And even now, in the quiet hum of old jukeboxes, in the flicker of classic motel signs, in the creak of a diner stool at 2 a.m., you can feel it, not just hear it, not just see it, but feel it. There's something almost holy about a road that endures through memory alone. Wherever Route 66 once ran, through the heart of Illinois, across the plains of Oklahoma, over the mesas of New Mexico, into the golden haze of California, it left footprints, not just on land, but in time. And in a way, that's what makes it eternal. You see, Route 66 was never meant to be efficient. It twisted, it lingered, it slowed you down just enough to notice. It was the kind of road that invited conversation, that encouraged detours, that reminded you the journey itself was the destination. And that's what made it so beautiful. It offered more than a way to get somewhere. It gave people a way to feel something, to remember who they were and who they might become. Somewhere between the start and the end, today many of its stretches lie quiet, Weeds poke through the cracks. Old motels stand like silent sentries. The gas pumps are dry. The windows are dusty. And yet, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The echo of laughter, the roar of a distant engine, the sizzle of burgers on a flat-top grill, the soft clink of spoons in milkshake glasses, the static of a distant radio playing Elvis or Buddy Holly as the sun fades low over a desert town. Somewhere it's still happening, not out there, but in here, in memory, in meaning. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of road. One that lives not on the map, but in the heart. So tonight, as you settle in, as the world around you goes quiet, as the day releases its grip, know this: Route 66 is still out there, in pieces, in spirit, in dreams, still calling, still glowing, still stretching westward like a promise you can almost keep. And maybe, just maybe, you'll ride it once again, if only in your mind. You'll pass a motel lit up in pink neon. You'll stop at a tiny cafe with cracked linoleum floors. You'll order a slice of pie that tastes like 1963. And when you do, you'll remember something you didn't know you'd forgotten: that the simplest places can hold the deepest magic. That slow is not the opposite of progress. Sometimes it's the point. So rest now. Let the memory of the open road rock you gently to sleep. Let the hum of tires on gravel, the sigh of wind through prairie grass, and the soft whisper of America's forgotten highway carry you into dreams. And as you drift off, remember, the road is never truly gone. It's just waiting. Quiet, timeless, and it'll be there whenever you're ready to ride again. Good night, dear listener. Wherever you are, may your roads be open, your skies wide, and your memories sweet. We'll see you again next time, right here in Sleepy Town Radio.